An elderly dog abandoned on the cold road trembled with fear until a majestic wild horse found him. What happened next touched hearts and changed fates forever. A story of unexpected protection, unlikely friendship, and a miracle of nature that no one could have predicted. Prepare for an emotional journey that will renew your faith in the purest bonds. Subscribe, leave a like, and comment where you're watching this incredible story from. What happens when abandonment becomes a beginning? When the loneliness of one being finds its unlikely companion in the darkest hour. Some stories are born from the shadows, revealing that compassion can arise in the most unexpected place, in the heart of those we least imagine. One autumn afternoon, as golden leaves danced in the wind like memories about to be forgotten, a car slowed down on the rural road winding through the Appalachian foothills of Virginia. The silence of that moment was broken by the crunch of tires on loose gravel. The back door opened with a mournful creak, as if the vehicle itself were protesting what was about to happen. An old golden Labrador, his coat faded by the years, was pushed out. His eyes, clouded with age but still expressive, reflected incomprehension. 12 years of loyalty ended like this, with a push and the roar of the accelerating engine. The car didn't hesitate. It sped away quickly, leaving behind only road dust and a confused animal, who, despite his advanced age and aching paws, still tried to run after the family abandoning him. "Come back, please come back," his bark seemed to say as he limped towards the car already disappearing around the bend, indifferent to his canine pleas. The animal's panting breath formed small clouds in the cold air. His muscles, once strong and agile, now protested with every step, until they finally gave out. The Labrador stopped, trembling not just from the cold that was beginning to intensify as evening fell, but from a primal understanding dawning within him. He had been left behind. But not all eyes are indifferent to the pain of others. In the adjacent pastures lining the road, an imposing horse, his coat as black as a moonless night, watched intently the scene that had just unfolded. He wasn't just any horse. The locals in that region knew him well, or rather, they knew the stories surrounding him. The guardian of the hills, they called him. A free spirit who had roamed those lands for years, fiercely rejecting any attempt at domestication. The black horse remained motionless for a few moments, only his watchful eyes moving, following the old dog now lying exhausted on the roadside. What was going through that wild mind? What thoughts crossed that consciousness humans so often underestimate? The elders of the region always said this horse possessed an ancient wisdom, an almost supernatural ability to sense the suffering of other beings. Were these just stories born from the imagination of people deeply connected to nature, or was there some truth to them? Darkness began to embrace the landscape. The danger grew with each passing minute for the helpless Labrador. Occasional cars sped past, their headlights briefly illuminating the dog's golden body, who no longer even had the energy to move away. It was then that the unthinkable happened. The black horse's hooves touched the ground softly as he approached, not with the ferocity he reserved for humans who tried to capture him, but with an almost reverent caution. The Labrador lifted his head, his tired eyes meeting those of the majestic animal now standing beside him. There was no fear, just a strange mutual understanding that transcended the barriers between species. With surprising gentleness, the horse used his muzzle to gently nudge the dog's body, guiding him away from the dangerous asphalt. The Labrador resisted at first, his instincts still tying him to the place where he had last seen his family. But the horse's insistence and the growing night chill finally convinced him. Stumbling, he followed the wild horse away from the road, entering the relative safety of the adjacent pastures. What no one could imagine was that this unlikely encounter, born from human cruelty and animal compassion, would be just the beginning of an extraordinary journey. A journey that, over the next 6 months, would not only change the lives of these two very different beings, but would touch human hearts and transform an entire community. The first few days were ones of cautious adaptation. The Labrador, who had known only the comfort of a human home his entire life, now needed to learn the rules of outdoor survival. The horse, in turn, needed to adjust his solitary habits to accommodate the presence of an elderly, frail companion. On the third night after the abandonment, the sky darkened ominously. Heavy clouds gathered, bringing not just the promise of rain, but the threat of a violent storm. The air grew thick, charged with electricity. For an old dog, recently abandoned and without shelter, such a night could be fatal. The first thunder rumbled like distant drums, announcing the fury to come. The frightened Labrador began pacing in circles, instinctively, looking for shelter. That's when the horse appeared again, moving with purpose. He didn't whinny, made no sudden movements. He simply positioned himself beside the dog and began walking, occasionally looking back as if inviting him to follow. And the dog followed. Through trails known only to the wild animals of that region, they moved forward as the first heavy drops began to fall. The path led them to a natural rock formation overhang above a small cavity, a perfect shelter from the storm that was now unleashing its full fury. There, sheltered from the torrential rain, the two animals spent the night. The horse positioned himself in a way that blocked the entrance, shielding the old dog from the cold winds accompanying the storm. This act, this gesture of protection, established an initial trust between them, a primal bond born not of words or promises, but of concrete acts of care. The rain washed the land, turned streams into raging torrents, brought down weak branches, and carried away the last autumn leaves. But when dawn finally arrived, bringing a shy sun trying to break through the remaining clouds, what the storm couldn't wash away was the new connection formed between those two unlikely survivors. From me. That day on, the dog began to follow the horse wherever he went. At first he kept a respectful distance like a shy admirer, but as the days passed, the distance lessened. Trust grew. For the few who had the privilege of observing them from afar, it was like watching a silent dance of mutual adaptation. The horse, slowing his pace to accommodate the old dog's tired legs. The Labrador, learning the body language of his new protector. Among the oldest residents of that Appalachian region, there is a belief deeply rooted in local folklore. Animals that bond during storms form blessed ties, created and approved by the elements themselves. Bonds forged in a storm last longer than life itself, the old-timers say. And perhaps there was some truth in this folk wisdom, for each passing day seemed to strengthen the bond between the wild horse and the abandoned dog. 1 week after this unlikely friendship began, another character entered this story. On the edge of a small plot of land that stood like an island amidst large agribusiness farms, lived a 45-year-old woman known in the region as much for her unwavering determination as for her knowledge of medicinal plants. The daughter and granddaughter of folk healers, her calloused hands carried the legacy of generations of women who knew the secrets of the land. On that specific morning, while gathering herbs on the hills bordering her small property, her watchful eyes caught an unusual movement in the distance. Initially, she thought it was an illusion created by the morning light filtering through the trees. But as she watched more closely, the image became clear. The region's famous wild horse, the one known for his elusive nature, was walking slowly, followed by an old golden dog. The farmer stopped her work, letting her basket of herbs rest on the ground as she watched, fascinated that improbable scene. The horse occasionally stopped, looking back as if checking if his companion could keep up. When the dog showed difficulty on rougher terrain, the horse adjusted his path, seeking easier routes. "That's the most extraordinary thing I've ever seen," she murmured to herself, feeling an inexplicable emotion rising in her throat. In her life marked by loss, the premature death of her husband, the gradual shrinking of her land swallowed by large corporations, the departure of her children to the big city seeking opportunities, that sight seemed like a gift, a reminder that even in the natural world, seemingly governed by the law of the fittest, there was room for compassion and care. The woman carried her own burdens. Her small piece of land, the last remnant of the prosperous farm that once belonged to her family, was constantly threatened. Representatives from a large agricultural corporation regularly appeared at her door with purchase offers that, while tempting financially, would mean giving up not just land, but her very identity, her connection to her ancestors, her way of you. Watching those two animals, so different from each other but united by circumstances she didn't know, the farmer felt something awaken within her, a curiosity, an interest, perhaps even a purpose. Without much thought, she made a decision. She would help this unlikely pair, but she would do so respecting the horse's wild nature and the old dog's dignity. The next day, she returned to the same spot, this time carrying not only her basket for herbs, but also a small bowl of fresh water and a container with food suitable for senior dogs, knowledge acquired from caring for her own animals over the years. She placed everything at a strategic spot where she had observed the pair passing and moved away, partially hiding behind a leafy tree. The wait was long, but rewarding. When the black horse finally appeared on the horizon, always followed by the faithful Labrador, the farmer held her breath. She saw the horse stop, nostrils flaring, taking in the scent of the food, his alert eyes scanning for danger. The dog, however, immediately recognized the aroma of the prepared meal and moved forward eagerly. The horse whinnied, as if warning his companion of possible danger. But the old dog's hunger spoke louder. He approached the bowls cautiously, repeatedly looking back at the horse as if asking permission. After a few moments of hesitation, he began to eat ravenously, showing he likely hadn't eaten properly since his abandonment. The horse kept his distance, vigilant, his eyes fixed in the direction where the farmer hid. For a disturbing moment, the woman was certain he could see her, sense her presence. There was an intelligence in those eyes, an understanding that went beyond what is usually attributed to animals. This ritual repeated for several days. The farmer left food and water, moved away, and watched from a distance. Gradually, she introduced small changes. One day, she left the food closer to her hiding spot. On another, she remained visible while the dog ate, though motionless and silent. With each small adjustment, she tested the limits of the trust that was slowly being established. The horse remained wary, always keeping a safe distance, but he no longer stopped the dog from approaching the food, even when it was placed closer to the human presence. It was as if he had made an assessment and concluded that this particular woman posed no immediate threat to his canine companion. It was during one of these observations that the farmer noticed something previously overlooked. The old dog still wore a collar, worn by time and partially hidden by the fur on his neck. Using small binoculars she carried for identifying plants at a distance, she managed to distinguish a metal tag attached to the collar. It was worn, but still had something inscribed, possibly a name or information about the owner. This discovery sparked a new determination in her. It was no longer just about feeding an abandoned animal. Now she wanted to find out who could have abandoned an elderly dog on the side of a rural road. An indignation was growing inside her, a sense of justice that aligned perfectly with her own struggle against those who discarded what they deemed disposable, whether a faithful animal grown old or a small family property that stood in the way of so-called progress. In the following days, while continuing her routine of feeding the dog and observing the extraordinary partnership between him and the wild horse, the farmer also began a discreet investigation. She asked the few remaining neighbors if anyone had seen a car stopping on the road, if they knew any family with an old Labrador, if they had noticed anything suspicious recently. The answers were vague, evasive. In small rural communities like that one, people tended to protect their own, even when they disagreed with their actions. The code of silence wasn't easily broken. Furthermore, with the constant exodus caused by agribusiness expansion, many families had moved away in recent years, making it difficult to track down who the dog's owner might have been. The farmer, however, was known for her persistence. Stubborn as a mule, some said, with a mix of admiration and exasperation. The same determination that made her resist the pressure to sell her land now drove her to uncover the truth about the old Labrador's abandonment. While her discreet investigation continued, the relationship with the two animals evolved slowly. 2 weeks after the first food offering, she achieved something extraordinary. The dog allowed her to touch him briefly while he ate. The contact lasted only a few seconds, a gentle hand resting on the rough, matted fur. but it represented a huge breakthrough. The horse watched the scene from a few yards away, ears pricked, muscles tense, ready to intervene at the slightest sign of danger. But when the dog showed no fear, only acceptance of the human presence, the great wild animal seemed to relax slightly. It was during one of these brief contacts that the farmer finally managed to read what was engraved on the tag, Max, followed by partially faded letters that seemed to form a last name. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a name to replace the old dog or the Labrador in her thoughts. "Max," she called softly the next day when she left the food. The effect was instantaneous and moving. The dog lifted his head, his ears perked forward, his tired eyes lit up with a flicker of recognition. He knew that name. He remembered being called that. For a painful moment, the farmer imagined how many times he must have heard that name in the previous 12 years. How many memories were associated with those three simple sounds she now uttered. "Max," she repeated, and this time the dog approached more quickly, with more confidence. The days of cautious observation from afar were gradually coming to an end. A new chapter was beginning in this unlikely story, further uniting the woman's fate with that of the two animals she watched over. But life rarely follows a smooth, predictable path. 2 months after the initial abandonment, when a comfortable routine had been established, the farmer leaving food daily, the dog, Max, responding to his name and allowing longer petting sessions, the wild horse observing everything from a safe distance, the fragile balance was broken by an unexpected crisis. On a particularly cold morning, the farmer arrived at the usual spot with Max's food, but the dog didn't appear at the usual time. She waited, worried, until she finally spotted the black horse on the horizon. He came alone at a faster pace than usual. He stopped a few yards from her, whinnied loudly, and turned, as if expecting her to follow. "What happened? Where's Max?" she asked, knowing she wouldn't get a verbal answer, but impressed by the wild animal's behavior, which seemed to be deliberately communicating with her. The horse whinnied again, more impatiently this time, and took a few steps back the way. He'd come, turning to look at her. The message was clear even to someone less attuned to animal behavior. "Follow me." Leaving the food at the usual spot, the farmer followed the horse. He kept a constant distance, stopping occasionally to ensure she was still following. After about a 15-minute walk, they reached a small clearing sheltered by dense trees. There, lying on a makeshift bed of dry leaves, was Max. The situation was worrying. The old dog was breathing with difficulty, his eyes were dull, and a thick discharge ran from his nose. He didn't react when the farmer approached and called. His name just emitted a low, pained whimper. The advanced age, combined with months living in precarious conditions after a lifetime of domestic comfort, was finally taking its toll. The farmer knelt beside the sick animal, examining him carefully. Her knowledge of medicinal herbs, though extensive, was primarily focused on human treatments. But some basic principles applied to all living beings, and she knew how to recognize the signs of a serious respiratory infection. "I need to take him to my house," she murmured, more to herself than to the animals. "There I can care for him properly." But when she tried to lift Max into her arms, the wild horse, who until then had been observing the scene from a few yards away, suddenly moved forward, not aggressively, but positioning himself between her and the sick dog, his eyes fixed on hers in a silent challenge. The farmer backed away, understanding the dilemma. The horse had brought her here because, somehow, he understood she could help, but he didn't trust her enough to let her take his companion away. The trust that had been built over the weeks had clear limits. "All right," she said softly. "I understand your concern, but he needs help, and I can't bring it all here." After a moment of reflection, the farmer made a decision. She stood up slowly, always maintaining eye contact with the horse, and said, "I'll be back, I promise. I'll bring what I can to help him right here." The walk back to her house never seemed so long. Worry about Max's condition quickened her steps, while her mind worked frantically, planning what she would bring back to the clearing. In her kitchen, which also served as a small natural pharmacy, she quickly gathered various herbs and preparations. Wild honey with antibiotic properties, a concentrated echinacea infusion, dried mullein leaves known for their expectorant properties, ginger root to fight fever. She also prepared a kind of nourishing broth, simmering bones and meat with strengthening herbs, something that could be easily swallowed even by a very weakened animal. As she worked, she talked to herself, a habit she had developed over years of solitude. Who abandons an old animal to fend for itself? What kind of person does that after 12 years together? And what an irony of fate, to be saved by a wild animal, receive more compassion from a skittish horse than from his own human family. Her words carried not only indignation about Max's abandonment, but also deeper reflections on her own experiences. She herself knew well the feeling of being considered disposable, an obstacle to be removed to make way for so-called progress. Her small property, seen as insignificant by modern standards of agricultural efficiency, was constantly under pressure to be sold, sometimes through tempting financial offers, sometimes through more aggressive tactics, like diverting the water sources that traditionally irrigated her land. When she returned to the clearing, carrying a heavy bag with her medicinal preparations, she found the wild horse lying near the sick dog, as if trying to warm the old animal's trembling body with his own body heat. The scene was so unexpected, so contrary to the expected natural behavior of a wild animal, that the farmer paused for a moment, feeling her eyes fill with tears. The horse stood up as he sensed her approach, but he didn't move away completely as he usually did. He remained nearby, watching intently as she knelt again beside Max. The next few days established a new dynamic among the three. The farmer began visiting the clearing 3 times a day, always carrying new medicinal preparations and food appropriate for a sick dog. The horse, though still cautious, allowed these visits, seeming to understand that they were essential for his companion's recovery. During these visits, the woman talked constantly, to Max, to the horse, to herself. She told stories of her youth, of how she learned about medicinal herbs from her grandmother, of how she resisted the pressures to abandon her traditional way of life. In a way, she was sharing her own story of resilience and survival with those 2 unlikely survivors. On the 4th day, Max showed the first clear signs of improvement. His breathing became less labored, the fever broke, and he managed to eat with more appetite. When the farmer arrived for her morning visit, he even tried to stand to greet her, though his frail legs still trembled with the effort. But it was on the 6th day that the most significant moment occurred. While tending to Max, applying a healing salve to a small wound on his paw, the farmer felt a presence nearby. She looked up to find the black horse standing less than a yard away, watching her movements intently. Slowly, without sudden movements, she extended an open hand towards him, a gesture of peace, an offering of trust. The horse remained motionless for long seconds. Then, in a movement that took the farmer's breath away, he stretched out his neck and briefly touched her outstretched hand with his muzzle before pulling back. The contact lasted less than a second, but its significance was immense. A barrier had been broken, a new level of trust established. From that day on, the care for Max became a joint effort. The horse began allowing the farmer closer, sometimes even grazing peacefully while she treated the dog. On some occasions, he seemed almost to supervise the work, watching intently each application of medicine, each change in his canine friend's diet. As Max regained his strength, the farmer started bringing small gifts for the horse too, particularly sweet apples, fresh carrots harvested from her own garden. Initially, he refused to eat in her presence, waiting for her to move away. But over time, he eventually began accepting the offerings directly from her hand, an extraordinary gesture of trust for an animal that had always rejected any form of human interaction. Max's recovery coincided with a disturbing discovery for the farmer. Returning from one of her visits to the clearing, she found an official envelope at her door. Inside, a formal notice stating that part of her property, precisely the area including the hills where the wild horse lived, was being requisitioned for the construction of a section of highway that would facilitate the transport of agricultural products from the region. The document was full of technical terms and justifications about public interest and economic development, but its essence was clear. In a matter of months, heavy machinery would invade that natural sanctuary, destroying habitats, driving away local wildlife, and likely forcing the wild horse to abandon his territory. The news struck the farmer like lightning. It wasn't just another threat to her property, something she was sadly accustomed to. It was a direct threat to the delicate balance that had been established between her, Max, and the wild horse. It was the real possibility of destroying the habitat the horse had chosen, and consequently, the refuge he had created for the abandoned dog. For a moment, she felt crushed by the weight of the news. Who was she, after all? A lone woman fighting forces much larger than herself. A relic of a way of life many considered outdated. How could she face governments, corporations, and the relentless advance of so-called progress? But then, something stirred within her. A renewed determination, fueled not only by her own resistance, but also by the extraordinary story of resilience and compassion she witnessed daily in the relationship between the horse and the dog. If a wild animal could defy his own nature to protect a being in need, who was she to give up without a fight? The next day, instead of succumbing to despair, the farmer began a new battle. Armed with her deep knowledge of the local flora and fauna, she started meticulously documenting the biodiversity of the threatened region. She photographed native plant species, some with medicinal properties still little studied by formal science. She recorded the presence of wild animals, including some species that, though not officially classified as endangered, were becoming increasingly rare due to agricultural expansion. And of course, she documented the extraordinary friendship between the wild horse and the elderly dog. Carefully taken photos from a distance, short videos captured with a simple camera. Evidence of such an unusual interspecies relationship that it could intrigue even the most skeptical scientists. Her campaign began modestly, with visits to the local town hall and conversations with the few remaining neighbors in the region. Initially, she faced the same skepticism and indifference as always. Progress can't be stopped, some said. A highway will benefit everyone, others argued. But the farmer had an asset she hadn't possessed before. A story, a powerful narrative, about compassion, about how a wild animal had shown more humanity than many humans. And stories, as she well knew, have the power to touch hearts where rational arguments fail. Slowly, her campaign gained momentum. A reporter from the small regional newspaper, initially skeptical, became intrigued enough to visit the site and witness for himself the unlikely friendship between the horse and the dog. His article, though published in a limited circulation paper, was the first to draw attention to the situation. In the 4th month after Max's abandonment, an unexpected event added a new dimension to the story. The teacher at the only remaining elementary school in the region, inspired by the local newspaper article, organized a field trip for her students. The idea was simple. Use the story of the horse and the dog as the basis for an educational project on empathy and environmental preservation. The farmer, initially hesitant to allow noisy children near the animals, eventually agreed, setting strict rules. The students had to keep a safe distance, speak quietly, and follow all adult instructions. To her surprise, the children showed a respect and sensitivity that many adults seemed to have lost. Watching from afar, the children were amazed to see the large black horse grazing peacefully while the old Labrador rested in his shade. The teacher, a young woman with progressive ideas about education, used the opportunity to discuss not only environmental issues, but also values like loyalty, compassion, and respect for differences. What began as a simple field trip quickly turned into a broader school project. The children, deeply moved by what they saw, created drawings, wrote stories, and even short plays inspired by the horse and the dog. Their work was displayed first at the school, then in the small town square during the weekly market. Parents who had previously ignored the farmer's warnings about the environmental destruction the new highway would cause now heard their own children passionately defending the preservation of that piece of land where the horse who adopted a doggie lived. The story, amplified by childhood innocence and enthusiasm, began to penetrate the community consciousness. It was in this context of growing awareness that another character entered the story. a traveling veterinarian who covered rural areas, offering basic services for farm animals, heard about the case while attending to a neighboring property. Intrigued, he offered to examine the old Labrador. The farmer, who had treated Max with her traditional herbal knowledge, welcomed the offer gratefully. Although the dog was visibly better, his once dull coat now shone again, his eyes had regained some sparkle, and he could walk without showing as much discomfort. She knew her methods had limitations. The examination took place right in the clearing, with the wild horse watching from a safe distance, clearly wary of the stranger handling his canine companion. The veterinarian, a middle-aged man with decades of experience, worked with calm, confident movements, speaking softly to the animal throughout the procedure. "He's surprisingly well, considering his age and what he must have been through," he commented, carefully palpating the Labrador's joints. "You've done an excellent job caring for him." But the real surprise came when the vet ran a small device along Max's body, stopping when it emitted a beep as it passed over the animal's neck. "He has a microchip," he explained to the farmer's questioning look. "It's an identification device implanted under the skin. Not very common in rural areas, especially in older dogs, but it's becoming standard practice in cities." With a small handheld reader, the veterinarian managed to extract the information contained in the microchip, a registration number, and the name of a veterinary clinic in the nearest city, about 50 miles away. "I can make some calls," he offered. "Find out who the owners were, maybe understand why they abandoned an elderly animal this way." The farmer nodded, a mix of emotions swirling inside her. On one hand, she felt anger thinking about the people who had discarded Max like an old, useless object. On the other, there was a curiosity, a need to understand the circumstances that had led to that act of cruelty. 2 days later, the vet returned with surprising information. The microchip was registered to a family who had moved to the state capital about 3 months earlier, coinciding with the time Max was abandoned. Through contacts at the vet clinic, he had even managed to get a phone number. "I called them," he confessed a bit hesitantly. "Identified myself as a vet who found a Labrador with the microchip registered in their name." "And what did they say?" asked the farmer, feeling her heart race. At first they sounded shocked, like they'd seen a ghost. Then the man said they'd given the dog to relatives in the country, that they couldn't care for him in the big city anymore. Clearly a hastily invented lie. When I pressed him, mentioning the location and approximate date the dog was found, he hung up. The farmer absorbed the information in silence. Part of her wanted to confront those people directly, make them face the consequences of their actions, force them to see how their old companion had nearly died due to their abandonment. But another, perhaps wiser part, knew confrontation rarely leads to understanding or genuine remorse. What she didn't know, as she reflected on the situation, was that the simple phone call from the vet had triggered a chain reaction. The family, confronted with the evidence that their act of abandonment had been discovered, contacted the vet clinic, claiming there had been a misunderstanding, that they had left the dog temporarily with relatives while they settled in the big city. The story, however, didn't convince the head veterinarian at the clinic, who knew Max since he was a puppy, and had long suspected something was wrong when the family stopped bringing him for regular checkups, vaguely claiming he was in the country. Outraged, she shared the case with colleagues and on social media, without directly identifying the family, but detailing the abandonment of a senior patient who had been faithful for over a decade. The post, though discreet, was shared among veterinary professionals and animal rescuers. Soon, the story of the abandoned senior Labrador began to circulate widely, increasingly with more details, some accurate, others exaggerated through retelling. What no one predicted was that this narrative would eventually intersect with the local campaign against the highway construction. Someone made the connection. The abandoned dog was the same one now living in the company of the famous wild horse in the area, threatened by the road project. Suddenly, what had been a local environmental preservation story gained an additional dimension. It also became a story about redemption, second chances, and unlikely bonds that challenged the cold logic of disposal and so-called progress. 5. Months after the initial abandonment, the family who had left Max by the roadside found themselves in an uncomfortable situation. Pressured by both public opinion and colleagues and neighbors who had discovered their action, they decided to return to the region, claiming they wanted to clear up the misunderstanding and retrieve their pet. Their arrival at the farmer's small property generated immediate tension. The man, a burly figure with a defensive expression, insisted it was all a mistake, that they had left the dog temporarily in someone else's care, that they never intended to abandon him permanently. The woman, visibly uncomfortable, remained silent, while a teenager, presumably the couple's daughter, kept her gaze fixed on the ground, as if wishing she could disappear. "We've come to get Max," the man announced after a clumsy attempt at explanation. "He belongs to our family." The farmer chose her words carefully. No law could stop them from retrieving their dog, especially with the microchip proof. But her protective instinct, the same one that had made her care for Max during his illness, now screamed inside her. "Maybe we should ask Max himself what he wants," she suggested, trying to keep her voice calm. "Come with me." Reluctantly, the family followed the farmer along a trail that wound through the hills. As they neared the clearing where Max and the black horse usually stayed, she asked them to walk quietly and stop at a certain distance. The scene they found was etched forever in the memory of everyone present. The old Labrador lay peacefully on a bed of dry grass, while the imposing black horse grazed nearby, occasionally lifting his head as if checking on his companion's well-being. It was an image of peace and mutual trust, an unlikely alliance forged by shared adversity. "Max," the man called out, his voice echoing across the clearing. The Labrador lifted his head immediately, his ears perking forward in recognition. For a moment, everyone held their breath. The dog looked towards the voice, then slowly got up, his joints still a bit stiff despite the care he had received. The wild horse also reacted to the call, stopped grazing, his whole body tense, alert to potential danger. Max took a few hesitant steps towards the voice, then stopped, as if confused. The man called again, this time with a softer, almost pleading tone. The dog continued his slow advance, his tail starting a tentative wag in recognition. The teenager, who until then had remained emotionally distant from the situation, suddenly burst into tears. "Max!" she also called out, her voice choked with emotion. This second call seemed to awaken something deeper in the old dog. His pace became more determined, his tail now wagging with undeniable enthusiasm. There was recognition in his eyes, memory of bonds formed over years. For a painful moment, the farmer felt her heart clench. She was about to lose not just the dog she had helped save, but also an important part of the extraordinary story that had unfolded before her eyes. What would happen to the wild horse when his unlikely companion left? Would he return to his former solitude? Would he allow human approach again? But then something unexpected happened. Max, after advancing a few more steps towards his former owners, stopped suddenly. He turned his head, looking back towards the black horse who watched the scene with obvious tension. For long seconds, the old dog seemed torn, caught between past and present, between old bonds and new. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he turned back, not with his earlier hesitation but with decisive steps, returning to the wild horse's side, sitting down beside him as if silently declaring his choice. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with complex emotions. It was broken by the teenager's trembling voice. He doesn't want to come back with us." "That's ridiculous," the father retorted, taking a few steps forward. "He's just a dog. He doesn't understand what he's doing." But his words rang hollow even to his own ears. The image of the two animals side by side, the imposing wild horse and the old Labrador, carried an eloquence that no human argument could dispute. It was at this tense moment that a new voice joined the conversation. An elderly man who had been watching the group from a distance approached slowly. It was Mr. Abernathy, one of the last representatives of the old local families, respected for both his knowledge of local traditions and his practical wisdom. "Since I was a boy," he began, his voice slow but firm, "our people have a belief. We say that when an animal chooses its own path, going against what we expect of it, it's because it's following a deeper calling, a purpose we humans don't always understand. The man from the city opened his mouth to protest, but something in the elder's calm dignity made him hesitate. "Look closely," continued Mr. Abernathy, pointing to the two animals. "Your dog isn't abandoned or suffering. He's found a companion, a protector, maybe even a mission. Forcing him to leave this would be like uprooting a plant in its most beautiful bloom." The old man's words, though simple, carried the weight of wisdom accumulated over generations. They evoked a worldview where animals weren't just property, but beings entitled to their own choices and connections. The urban family, confronted, not only by Max's obvious reluctance to leave his new companion, but also by the ancestral wisdom expressed by Mr. Abernathy, found themselves in a moral dilemma they had never anticipated when they decided to return to retrieve their dog. It was the teenager who finally verbalized what everyone was beginning to feel. "He's happy here, isn't he? Happier than he'd be with us in the small apartment, alone all day while we're out." Her words, laden with painful honesty, seemed to dissipate the tension. The mother, who had remained silent until then, placed a hand on her husband's shoulder. She didn't need to say anything. Her look communicated everything. That moment of recognition, of reluctant acceptance of an uncomfortable truth, marked a turning point not only in the story of Max and the wild horse, but also in the campaign to protect that area from the highway construction. The family who had once abandoned the old dog, confronted with the unexpected consequences of their action, and touched by the extraordinary relationship that had developed, became an unlikely ally in the fight to preserve the natural habitat where Max now lived. "What can we do to help?" the man asked the farmer before leaving. His voice, previously defensive, now held the tone of someone seeking redemption. This simple question opened the way for unexpected collaboration. Since the man was a lawyer in the capital, his legal knowledge and professional contacts became valuable resources in the complex battle against the highway project. The family, perhaps trying to compensate for the earlier abandonment, committed to visiting regularly, bringing supplies for Max and contributing to the preservation efforts. In the 5th month after the initial abandonment, the farmer had an idea that would definitively change the course of events. Inspired by the extraordinary story she had witnessed, she proposed turning part of her property into a sanctuary for abandoned animals, a refuge where other Maxes could find a second chance. The idea gained immediate support from the local community, already mobilized by the environmental cause and the touching story of the horse and the dog. Volunteers emerged, offering labor, materials, technical expertise. Among them, surprisingly, was the very family who had abandoned Max. Their involvement, though initially viewed with suspicion by some, carried a powerful symbolism of repentance and redemption. The first new residents of the sanctuary arrived a few weeks later. 3 elderly cats abandoned when their owner passed away, a pig with a disabled leg who had escaped slaughter, some chickens rescued from a factory farm. The farmer watched, amazed as the wild horse seemed almost to understand the place's purpose, staying ever alert, but allowing the approach of the other animals, as if he had taken on the role of guardian of this makeshift refuge. Max, meanwhile, seemed rejuvenated in his role as ambassador, the first to greet the new residents, wagging his tail in welcome, guiding them around the grounds with almost paternal patience. The story of the sanctuary and its unlikely founders, a stubborn farmer, an abandoned dog, and a wild horse, began to spread beyond the limits of the small rural community. Journalists from larger outlets appeared, attracted by the unusual narrative. Reports were published, first in regional newspapers, then in nationally circulated magazines. It was one of these reports that, by an extraordinary chance, reached the hands of a high-ranking official at the state environmental agency. This woman, who had grown up in a similar small rural community before pursuing a career in the capital, felt deeply moved by the story. More importantly, she immediately recognized the ecological and cultural value of that piece of land that was about to be destroyed to make way for a highway. Using her position and technical knowledge, she initiated a re-evaluation process for the road project, highlighting not only the local biodiversity, but also the cultural and educational value that the newly created sanctuary represented. Shimai relied on an old, almost forgotten state law that valued cultural traditions related to harmonious coexistence between humans and nature, traditions the sanctuary had revitalized so eloquently. 6 months after Max's initial abandonment, when the dry pastures of late autumn had given way to the vibrant green of spring, an official decision was announced. The highway route would be modified, preserving the sanctuary area and its surroundings. The victory, though partial in the broader context of the fight for environmental preservation, was significant. A rare moment when the small triumphed over the large, when values like compassion and respect for nature prevailed over purely economic logic. On the day the news arrived, the farmer sat on her farmhouse porch, watching the golden sunset over the preserved hills. In the distance, she could see the black horse and the old Labrador resting side by side under the shade of a leafy tree. Other rescued animals grazed or rested nearby, forming a peaceful picture that contrasted sharply with the threat that had loomed over the place just weeks before. Reflecting on the extraordinary events of those 6 months, she understood she had witnessed something rare and precious, a chain of compassion that began with an unlikely act of kindness between different species and expanded to include an entire community. What had begun as a tragedy, the cruel abandonment of an elderly animal, had transformed into a story of redemption, new beginnings, and unexpected connections that changed lives. Perhaps, she thought, this was the true lesson of that extraordinary journey, that even in the darkest moments when we seem abandoned on the side of our own metaphorical roads, there exists the possibility of finding unexpected allies, forging new bonds, and discovering purposes we never imagined. The sun continued its majestic descent, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. Soon it would be night, but unlike that lonely night 6 months earlier, when an old dog trembled with cold and fear by the roadside, this night would be marked by the security of bonds formed, battles won, and a future preserved. Not just for 2 unlikely animals, but for all who found refuge on that small, resilient piece of land. And who knows, perhaps one day, when another being found themselves lost, abandoned, without hope, this story could serve as a reminder that compassion can arise from the most unexpected places, that deep bonds can form between the most different beings, and that it's never too late for a new beginning. The farmer smiled, feeling a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. The gentle spring breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and fulfilled promises. The approaching night wasn't an end. It was just the beginning of a new chapter in a story that would continue to be written, day after day, by paws, hands, and hearts united by something stronger than any difference: the simple, profound capacity to care for one another.